maybe we weren't giving enough of a greeting to our other video platforms, so we're going to get ready to do that right now. Say hello to all of them. And by the way, good morning to you. If you're checking in on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all the video platforms, happy to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp today. We'll get ready to join you and do the show here in just a moment as we're finishing up our First and 15 on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. And if you watch on one of the other video platforms, you want to be a part of the comments that we do prior to the show beginning, just check us out. Very easy to find right there at DawgNation.com at the top of the page, or click into that DawgNation app and you get a chance to see that for yourself there. What we're talking about here just for a moment before you begin the show, Brian Whitehead, one of our commenters, had mentioned the change that's been reported. A lot of this is very confusing because some of this is just sort of related to minutia and interpretation and whatever else. But there was some reporting out there, Mike Griffith wrote about this at DawgNation.com, that recruits will be allowed at the Georgia-Florida game now, and this is impacting the home team, my understanding is, not both teams, but the home team has the option now of basically leaving tickets for recruits. Still can't have any contact with them and still can't have them down there on the sideline and things like that like you would do in an Athens environment, but you can leave tickets for them. Now, reading a lot about this in the last few days, or last, 24 hours or so, this has actually been allowed by rule as far back as 2012. But Georgia and Florida had kind of a gentleman's agreement not to do this, and probably that was financially related because you could sell those tickets for a lot more, and not selling them means that's revenue you essentially eat. So since 2012, both these programs have had the option to do this and just kind of chosen not to. Well, from now on, that's not what the two schools are going to choose to do, at least on the Georgia side of this, being the home team, in air quotes here, for this upcoming year. They're not going to do that. They're going to leave tickets for the recruits. I agree with Brian on this. Ultimately, I don't believe this changes Kirby Smart's larger opinion that the Georgia-Florida game should be a home and home, and Kirby's reason for doing this being related to recruiting. I don't think this stops him from feeling that way. And probably doesn't stop a lot of Georgia fans who kind of want to see Smart get what he wants. I also don't think this is nothing either. I don't think this is like a total disregard. This is unimportant. I think there is probably a little something to this. I remember being down on the field last year prior to the Georgia-Clemson game in Charlotte, and that being kind of a one-off game. You had sort of different rules related to giving tickets to recruits, and this is something that Georgia definitely wanted to do. This is something, my understanding, that Clemson was sort of dragged into. They didn't want the hassle of having to deal with all of this, and so there was a little bit of on-field drama before the game about recruits that both Georgia and Clemson were pursuing, who chose to sit in the Georgia section with the Georgia recruits and who chose to sit in the Clemson section unofficially with the Clemson recruits. And there was a little bit of recruiting drama related to that in a game last year where neutral site tickets were made available to recruits. That's not typically how this has been done. And for Georgia-Florida, that's been kind of the thing that has not been in place, even though by rule you could do it. So now that they are going to give tickets, I think there is some value to it, but ultimately not enough value that it makes Kirby say, all right, that's it, that's enough. I don't have to worry about playing this game home and home anymore. Smart wants the game in Athens every other year, willing to go to Gainesville every other year to get what he wants there on that. But it's also one of those weird things that there are a lot of considerations here beyond just what Kirby wants. And so while I think just the large-scale changes on the way for the SEC from a scheduling standpoint, I think that probably means that this eventually changes, because it seems like so much in college football is changing right now. Kirby's opinion on this alone may not quite be enough to swing the balance, at least as of yet. So that's kind of where things stand on that. All right, let me do what time is it? Do I have time here? All right, let me do one more comment. We're going to get ready to go. Hemingway says, I wanted to preserve the world's largest outdoor cocktail party tradition, but I have become convinced Kirby is correct. Time to make it home and home. We'll always have the memories of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. So when Greg McGarity was athletic director, I asked him about this. I said, what is the split among fans themselves? How many want the game in Jacksonville? How many want the games in a home and home situation? And McGarity didn't have market research to base this on, but he was kind of surmising that it was about half and half. That about half the people, wanted the home and home. For season ticket buyers, you hear them say a lot, hey, I want more value for my season ticket. I want more big home games. And obviously the Florida game every other year would be about as big as you could get as a part of a regular home slate. There are a lot of folks who want that. But it's also important to know that Athens, while it's the home of the University of Georgia and it's the place where the Dogs play, it is not necessarily the epicenter of Dog Nation. I mean, Athens is not a very big town. The surrounding counties aren't very populous either. That, Dog Nation, to the extent it even, sort of within the state of Georgia is spread all throughout the state. And there are a lot of people, as you know, and this is well-traveled ground by now, but there are a lot of people who live in South Georgia and who travel to Athens every time they play. The Jacksonville trip is like the one home game they have. And so that's part of what's kind of going on there as well. But for a lot of people, if Kirby wants it one way, that's going to kind of be enough for them. And so clearly Kirby is a big voice in this discussion for a conversation that's going to be ongoing. We'll talk more about this in the regular show, including giving you a reminder later on of exactly what Smart has said about this. But for now, we're running a little bit late, so let's see if we can pick up the pace here just a bit. DawgNation Daily coming up today. Really fun stuff. We'll get into the Georgia-Florida stuff in a minute. An interesting look at exactly who might be a big breakout performer from this very impressive crop of freshman defensive backs that Georgia signed from the class of 2022. What Smart has said about that, maybe trying to tamper some expectations and dampen some expectations, and yet some in the media still seemingly seeing a few guys that could have a chance to have a really big year. We'll talk about that. But off the top, for every bit of attention that some young Georgia players are getting, there is one big-time dog, maybe the biggest dog of them all for this upcoming season, who might actually not be getting the full attention that he deserves. And this, for a lot of Georgia fans, may end up feeling like a good thing because in a lot of ways it may end up reminding you this year of the narrative that was in place for Georgia last year. We know how last season ended. So what do you say we start that way? It's DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I think you see something pretty interesting emerging right now when it comes to a certain narrative that's sort of out there related to UGA that starts to feel a little bit like something that's kind of existed in the past, including last year. And we know how well that turned out for Georgia in 2021. And for every UGA fan who, rightly so, wants to replicate this season what Georgia had last season, we got an example maybe today of how true that is. I want to focus for a moment on Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter, I believe, is probably Georgia's best player for the upcoming season. And when you look back on Georgia a year ago, despite the fact that the Dogs had 5 eventual first-round picks on defense and all kinds of playmakers that contributed to a national championship season, the truth is, based on your own eye test or based on the stats or based on whatever else, Carter put together a year last year that put him right alongside all of the guys that departed off last year's team, even though Carter was at least a year younger than most of those guys, if not 2 years younger in some cases. The performance that Jalen Carter gave you last year kind of puts you right there in the conversation for anybody a year ago, and all of a sudden this team sort of belongs to him now. That he emerged last season in a way that Georgia fans were certainly very well aware of. And now here in 2022, not playing in the shadow and the spotlight of guys like Trayvon Walker and Devontae Wyatt and Jordan Davis, he gets to show the world what he's already shown UGA fans about just how valuable that he can be, and maybe a little bit of evidence thus far that maybe not all of that has been noticed to the degree that it possibly could. Let me start this way. So I think one of the most thoughtful players in the Georgia roster right now is Zion Logue. Now, I also think that Logue himself can have a really big year for UGA, kind of doing some of the things that Jordan Davis did last season. Certainly unfair to say Zion Logue is the next Jordan Davis for Georgia, because that is truly a load to live up to because of all the different ways in which Jordan Davis was a leader by example on the field, but also a spiritual, emotional leader, off the field. But we know that Zion Logue is a pretty important part of this situation for UGA here this season. In fact, he was one of the players tabbed last week to speak about the Dogs as the upcoming season kicked off, and that summer camp kind of kicked off for UGA last week. And one of the things that he discussed there for a moment is the luxury that you have as a defensive lineman getting to line up and play alongside a Jalen Carter. I think this is really good. He was asked specifically, hey, what are all the ways in which Carter's going to be used here? And that kind of, sort of leads into the notion of, how about you getting a chance to play alongside him and kind of form sort of a partner in crime with him and wreaking havoc on those opposing offenses. This is all really good from Logue. Now, it's, once again, you got a lot of room noise and door slamming and things like that. You just can't seem to eliminate that when it comes to some of these player interviews, but I at least want you to get a taste of this, and hopefully you can make it out. Zion Logue talking about the luxury of playing next to a great defensive lineman like Jalen Carter. Take a listen to this.
I mean, I don't even think he knows. I think he's just being him, and just like being that strong enforcer. Like, he's not going to be blocked. He's not going to want you to block him. He don't want you to touch him. So whenever he can quick swim you or get you off of him, I think that's when he's at his best.
Does it make your job easier having played beside him, knowing the attention he's probably going to get?
I think we piggyback off each other. I think it like makes both of our jobs easier because we know where we need to be. We know what we got to do. So we can just look at each other and be like, hey, we got to do this, we got to do that. So I think it kind of plays both hands.
So you hear Zion Logue talking about the value of a guy like Jalen Carter, what he brings to the table. Obviously, as impressive as he is, and yet you sort of get the impression that not everybody realizes what Zion Logue knows, what Georgia fans themselves saw of Carter last season. You get the impression, as good as Jalen was, that he hasn't fully introduced himself yet to the rest of the country, national media or fans kind of outside the bubble of DawgNation. Sort of get the impression that hasn't happened yet. I thought that Connor Riley had an interesting piece at DawgNation.com this week looking at a guy named Bruce Feldman. Feldman's kind of a famous, fancy national writer, and one of the things that he does each and every year, which I think is actually really like a fun piece, he does his 100, he calls them his freaks. These are like the athletic freaks, guys who have a level of athleticism, oftentimes combined with great size, that's unlike anything, we used to see, right? These are like the top end of the top end in terms of truly elite athletes that kind of bring a huge level of wow factor, either because of a combination of size and strength or because of outright speed or whatever else. And Georgia had 3 players on the so-called freaks list from Bruce Feldman, who now writes for The Athletic, although he's been writing this piece, I believe, predating his time there for the subscription website. But the Georgia freaks, according to Bruce Feldman, are Keely Ringo, Arian Smith, and Brock Bowers. And no one, I think, would dispute, well, when you look at Arian Smith's speed, obviously he belongs in a discussion like this. And no one would dispute Keely Ringo in a place like this either. Just, beyond the fact that he had the game-winning interception in the national championship game, Ringo's got this great speed, but also from a cornerback standpoint, got the big frame, long arms, stands up pretty tall. This is a pretty big guy to be doing what he's doing from the cornerback position. These are the kinds of athletic freaks that Georgia seeks when it comes to its defensive backs, and Ringo obviously is a version of that. When you see Brock Bowers doing what he's doing, it's obvious that he ought to be on a list there as well. When a guy like that, big enough to play tight end, catches the football, turns and runs, and in a lot of cases it leaves defensive backs just sort of standing in his wake, well, that's obviously an athletic freak. Maybe he doesn't give that vibe off standing up and just kind of walking around in street clothes the way that an Eric Gilbert or a Darnell Washington would, but watching him play, you clearly know he brings sort of a freakish athletic ability to the table. It doesn't take very long to notice that when you're watching him play. But there's part of me that wonders, where's Jalen Carter on this list? And this is not like one of those official lists. This is not the kind of thing to be mad about. But it is, I think, at least a little bit interesting that a guy like Carter, who has been as good as he's been, still hasn't quite gotten the level of attention that maybe he should. And it kind of fits into a larger narrative that seems to have been out there for the Georgia defense for a while. Because another thing that Zion Logue talked about in the press conference interview that I just played you a clip from a moment ago was the notion that Logue wants to see Georgia get back to being what it was last season, an athletic, kind of a no-name defense. That's what Georgia was sort of thought to be a year ago. I've never really liked that moniker for the Georgia, defense, because the truth is, for me, the reason why I think no one player stood out from the rest of the crowd last season is not because they were all nondescript and role players, things like that. It's almost because they were all so good that no one player could outshine the rest of the group. I sort of think of last year's defense, sort of the college football version, what the 92 Dream Team once would have been. Like, there's no superstar on the group because everybody's a superstar. And so from that standpoint, sometimes I think the notion of the no-name defense, which Georgia kind of got tabbed with from time to time, was a little bit of a misnomer and a little bit of an incorrect moniker. But Zion Logue said this week he'd like to see Georgia kind of get back to that. He wants to see Georgia kind of re-embrace that, himself included, and his teammates sort of embrace that. Well, if you're looking to see Georgia be a no-name defense again here in 2022, Jalen Carter not being noticed for the athletic freak that he is, maybe that's a step in the right direction for you on this, because certainly Carter's level of play on the field would suggest that he ought to be on anybody's list of athletic freaks, and he ought to be on anybody's radar if you're a national writer or just sort of big-time college football fan who thinks of yourself as very plugged in. Jalen Carter ought to very much be someone that you're very well aware of, if not for the reason we've said before, that there's already plenty of ESPN folks who sort of think of him as a potential number one overall pick, or at least a guy that could be taken in the top 10 very early on in the first round of the NFL draft. At the very least, Carter's in a discussion like that. But when you look at what he did a year ago, playing in the shadow of other eventual first-round picks like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt and Trayvon Walker, once again, Carter seemingly more than held his own. Let me show you this stat on the screen if you're watching on video from a tweet from Bill Conley. Sometimes the analytic stuff, the fancy stat stuff can be a little overwhelming and, frankly, a little bit boring. But in Conley's case here, he gives us a stat that's very easy to understand. I'm going to read this to you. He tweeted this just a couple of days ago on August the 9th. Conley writes, on last year's Georgia defense, do-everything linebacker Nakobe Dean made tackles on 11.4% of the snaps he was in the game. Conley says that's a very high percentage, and it's easy to understand why Dean's percentage would be so high. He was flying around all over the field. However, by way of comparison, Conley writes that Jalen Carter, the guy we're talking about right now, made tackles on 11.7% of his snaps. Conley says as a 310-pound nose tackle he's doing that? That's unfair. So what Conley's saying here is that a guy like Nakobe Dean flying around all over the place, that actually Jalen Carter last year had tackles on a slightly higher percentage of the snaps he was on the field than Nakobe Dean did last season. That gives you an idea of the kind of athleticism that Carter's bringing to that defensive line position, and it's one of the reasons why I think he probably is the best player on this entire roster for the upcoming season, certainly in this defense. And anybody's definition of an athletic freak, it's pretty obvious that's exactly what Jalen Carter is. Now, we also heard a little chatter about Carter the other day when Glenn Schuman, one of those new co-defensive coordinators for the Dogs, when he met with reporters, I thought Connor Riley asked him a very good question. Obviously, our colleague, Connor. He said, hey, what does the best version of Jalen Carter look like? How can you best deploy the prodigious skill set that he brings to the table? And Schuman kind of speaks in some careful language here, but nonetheless, on the theme of what we're talking about right now, this is what Schuman said that he's looking to see more of from Jalen Carter this season, this from the other day.
I think the best version of anyone, right, is somebody who plays, when you play defensive football, you have to, play at a certain level in terms of your effort, right, and toughness, your mentality, your competitive edge, right? So the best version for him, anyone else in the front, anyone else in the defense would be those traits, playing as hard as you possibly can with the toughness required, and competing, right? You got to win your battles, right? And that's what we'll expect of all our guys, and especially him.
So let me see if I can sum this up this way. I'm not mad that Jalen Carter was overlooked on an unofficial list from a national writer, nor do I think you should be either. If anything, it's probably a good thing, because here's the one thing we know. Carter won't be overlooked come NFL draft time, because the path that he's traveling right now looks pretty similar to the path that a few Dogs traveled last season. Kind of not really paid that much attention to in the preseason chatter, and sort of thought to be ensemble pieces in a so-called no-name defense, and yet they added together to become component parts to an eventual national champion. And a lot of those guys are very rich men today, already turning heads in their first NFL training camp. And for Georgia fans who want this year to be like last year, this is a clue that, hey, at least in one respect, it kind of is. The very good players, true freaks, game-changing performers aren't quite getting the attention that maybe they deserve, that they haven't quite fully acquainted themselves, I'm talking about folks outside our bubble, with exactly how good guys like Jalen Carter are. But UGA fans can rest well knowing with full confidence that come September 3rd against Oregon and every other game after that, they'll remember the name of exactly who Jalen Carter is. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and we are glad to have you with us. No matter how you get to us today, live on video. We start 9:45, first and 15, DawgNation.com, and on the DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon. on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. And we really appreciate our friends at Merriweather and Tharp for being a big part of what we're doing here around here. They are your source for Georgia divorce. And I realize that's not as much fun as the normal topic we talk about. Georgia football and Jalen Carter kind of introducing himself to the national media and showing why he's about to be a top 10 pick. That's a fun discussion, right? Everybody wants to be a part of that. At least around here we do. But the divorce conversation, that's not one that you necessarily would volunteer to be a part of. But some of you have found yourself in a discussion like that nonetheless. And here's what I can tell you. If I could make this disappear for you, I really would. And if you can save your marriage, you should. But if you find yourself in the situation where your relationship's just coming to an end, that's where Merriweather and Tharp can step in. They can be a big resource for you because they are your source for Georgia divorce. That means they can explain to you how the law is going to work for you. They can talk about how it impacts your finances. They can talk about how it impacts your children or what comes next for you in life. Because here's what we truly believe. The next season of your life can be a happy one. And you can make decisions now that benefit you then. But our folks at Merriweather and Tharp are going to be an important resource for you as you learn how to do all that. So check out their website. It's theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. You can engage with their free resources like blog posts and podcasts and things like that. And that can educate you on how to ask better questions when you have that free initial consultation with one of their attorneys. And after that, you can make the decision to hire Merriweather and Tharp to work for you to make sure you get everything you need, everything you deserve, and to make sure you are well set up for what comes next for you in life after this. So reach out to my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. You can find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. Merriweather and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. All right, we're going to get Terrence Edwards here coming up in a moment. Always fun to do a Marlow's Tavern Insider Update with Terrence here. Looking forward to being back at Marlow's again on September 1st. We'll talk more about that then. First, though, let's get ready to go around the Doghouse. And it's presented today by our friends at Serve Pro. And I want to stay on the theme of defense here for a moment because in one example a moment ago, hey, a Georgia player maybe not getting the attention that he deserves. Another example here of maybe a young UGA player possibly getting more attention than a guy like Kirby Smart would want him to get. You know, Kirby was asked last week about a lot of those young sort of standout recruits from the class of 2022, and in particular, the position group that has such a large number of those right now is in the defensive secondary. Georgia signed a secondary haul last season, especially when you think about a reclassified Marcus Washington kind of added into this. Georgia signed a secondary haul last year that literally, for someone like me, even who's given to, prone to hyperbole, I'm not quite so sure you can be too hyperbolic about this. One of the best secondaries that's ever been signed by anybody was signed by Georgia in the 2022 recruiting class. That's how good that it was. And so, as you might imagine, as Georgia's kicking off summer camp and getting ready to go with these practices that will lead into the start of the 2022 season, Smart was asked to assess, hey, Jaheim Singletary and Dalen Everett and Malachi Starks and Julian Humphrey, a lot of these big guys that you brought in, how you feeling about these guys right now? And Smart's pretty careful to say, listen, let's be careful not hyping these guys up too much. This was Smart on his young, talented, new-coming defensive backs from last week.
Yeah, I'm excited. I feel like most of them are not really freshmen because I guess a couple of them were with us in spring. So the two safeties, Malachi and Ja'Cory, got a lot of work in the spring, and they still got a long way to go to be a viable option to play this year. You show me a freshman DB that played in the SEC, I'll show you a guy that gave up plays. All right, that's the common denominator. Now, every now and then you have a guy come along who's just, I think of when Stingley was a freshman. I think of a couple of those guys that had to play as freshmen. They played really big. It happens from time to time, and if you're going to have a guy be an elite player as a freshman, it's usually at a skill position like receiver, running back, or defensive back. I don't foresee one of those guys just coming in and dominating. A lot of the accolades that come with them, they dropped them at the door, and they go to sweating and they go to work. So we're not going to live off high rankings and what people said about them, because there's a lot of good football players out there that you guys didn't rank high or didn't have high. So it goes both ways. We will need those guys to be core special teams players. We will need those guys to be ready to play in the case of injuries, targetings, or whatever may be there. But we've got to get them ready by how we prepare in this training camp, and I'm excited about all those guys.
So maybe kind of a classic level of D recruiting there from Kirby Smart. We've seen coaches do this for what seems like eons of, hey, you guys rated these guys high, but y'all rated plenty of guys in the past before high, and they didn't go on to be the kinds of players that we think they could be. What Kirby's saying there sounds a lot like what we've heard coaches say in the past. And as I said before, you can maybe make the case that not everybody fully realizes how good a veteran player like Jalen Carter it really is right now. But Smart would probably say, hey, some of my young guys, freshmen in defensive back situation in particular, maybe they're getting more attention than I want them to get. I saw where ESPN.com the other day listed Malachi Starks, for instance. That's one of the guys that Smart mentioned there directly as one of the top newcomers in college football for the upcoming season, along with Mikael Williams. We'll probably focus more on Mikael at some point in time in the future, but Starks was kind of mentioned as one of those guys, and the reason Starks was included, according to the ESPN writers, was the fact that it's kind of viewed that maybe Georgia's a little thin at safety right now. Maybe you need a boost from one of your freshmen, and maybe a guy like Starks, because of how highly rated he was as a recruit, maybe has a chance to get that done. And maybe that is the case. I think it remains to be seen if Georgia truly is thin at safety. We know they have an outstanding one in Christopher Smith, and you got guys like Dan Jackson who've certainly played at a high and competent level prior to that. So maybe Georgia's not quite as thin as ESPN seems to suggest there, but that doesn't change the outlook for Starks, who, if you're betting on freshmen to kind of step up and play in a big way, you might put a chip or two down on the Starks part of the table there, because I think he could do that. I also thought it was really interesting when Smart was asked, because Starks is technically listed as an athlete on the Georgia roster. Does that mean he's going to play some offense? Smart gave you as short an answer as you can get on that, saying no, that's not the case. They're clearly focusing him in on the defensive side right now, and I do think that ESPN may end up being right about this, and maybe he does end up kind of breaking out a bit. What I've told you before is that if we put 100 smart Georgia fans in a room, guys and gals who follow this stuff pretty closely, and we said, of these freshman defensive backs, who do you like the most, and who do you think could play the best, the soonest for Georgia? Some people would say Malachi Starks. Some people might say Dalen Everett. Some people might say Slim Singletary. Some people might even say Julian Humphrey or Ja'Cory Thomas, or on and on you go. You may have different people who gravitate towards different names. They wouldn't have brought Marcus Washington Jr. in as a 2022 signing if they didn't think he'd get a chance to do that either. So there's different reasons to gravitate towards different guys. And while I may not be quite so sure which of these freshmen is going to truly pop the quickest for Georgia, my assumption is, just based on the law of large numbers, that one of them probably will. That for a Georgia secondary that includes what I think of as probably a couple of sure things in Keely Ringo and Christopher Smith, and probably a couple of unanswered questions, the opposite cornerback, the opposite safety. Before the year is done, it seems likely to me that one of these hotshot incoming freshmen inserts themselves in a big way into this discussion and becomes the kind of guy that Georgia can rely on. There are probably some growing pains along the way. Smart warns you about that there. But some of those growing pains may result in a pretty capable player by the time Georgia gets to the games that matter most. That is Around the Doghouse, and it's presented today by our friends at ServPro. And listen, ServPro steps up for you at a time in which you really need them. Let's say you have fire damage in your home. Let's say you have water damage. Let's say you have things like that. Well, for something like your home, which you have a huge emotional connection to, that can be a really overwhelming thing to experience, and that's why ServPro steps in to clean it all up, get it all fixed. Their restoration specialist can take care of this for you like it never even happened. And honestly, that's what you want in a situation like this. You want it to all go away, and ServPro can basically be that. They can clean it up for you like it never happened. If you're watching on video, you see what their army of equipment and folks look like showing up at your home or your commercial facility, whatever else, and getting you cleaned up, getting you taken care of, and that's what ServPro is all about. They're also, all their franchises are independently owned and operated, which means you're doing business with someone that has just as much of a stake in the outcome as you do. They want you to be happy because that's how they thrive. That's how their business grows. And so that's what they are all about. So my invitation to you is to check them out online, servpro.com. That's SERV, servpro.com. Find out about what their restoration specialists can do for you if you've dealt with fire damage or water damage or anything like that that can make for a pretty substantial cleanup. ServPro is all about that. And they can fix you up literally like it never even happened. So find out more, servpro.com, to check out ServPro today. That's SCRV, servpro.com. All right, before we're done, we're going to kind of get into this sort of odd dust-up over the course of the last couple of days related to recruits at the Georgia-Florida game. What's truly going on with all of this? We'll talk about that before we are done here today. But for now, everything on UGA with a big first scrimmage looming on Saturday. Let's talk about the Dogs' preseason preparations with our good friend Terrence Edwards. It is a Marlow's Tavern Insider Update. Glad to have him and all of you with us here today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Great to see Terrence Edwards here on DawgNation Daily and our Marlow's Tavern Insider Update. And Terrence, I was mentioning this a moment ago, and first of all, it's nice to have you here. But Saturday is a pretty big day for the Dogs in terms of the coaches, their ongoing evaluation of kind of what you look like, getting ready for September 3rd, but also for players who kind of want to make a name for themselves and make sure they are in line to be a part of the game planning once it finally happens to get ready for the Ducks in Oregon on September 3rd. Making a name for yourself in a scrimmage like this is probably a pretty big deal, is it not?
Oh, it is. Definitely is. It's an opportunity to show the coaches that you can actually, help the team. It's a big trust factor right now. It's different just going 11-on-11 with the coaches standing behind you. Now it's a full-fledged scrimmage with coaches on the sideline. There's no one behind you kind of holding your hand, per se, in 11-on-11 drills and 7-on-7. Now it's a full-fledged scrimmage, and now you get to put it on tape. Everything that you've been training for, everything that you've been practicing for, now you get to put it on tape. I don't know if it's going to be in between the hedges or at the practice field, but it's a big opportunity for a lot of the young guys, or even the guys who haven't played as much, to go ahead and put your resume on tape so the coaches now can evaluate you and possibly elevate you into a starter's role or a secondary role.
Yeah, you mentioned traveling over to the stadium for that. That's what Georgia will do on Saturday, and I try to put myself in the mind of a player, and obviously I don't have the body of a player, so I would never be able to know what they go through necessarily, but I have to imagine that after a few days of being, whether it be in the indoor facility or the regular practice field, it must feel a little bit different to go over to the stadium. It must feel a little bit different to kind of be in that environment where the actual games are played, and if you're trying to create a game-like environment for a scrimmage, the true kind of competitive nature of 11-on-11 football, then being there between the hedges for that's probably about the easiest way to make that happen, right?
Oh, most definitely. And it's also like the ride over, especially for guys who haven't had an opportunity to see the operations of what happens from the Bucksmere to the field. Riding that bus, the anticipation of going into the stadium. It's different, man. When you look up, and granted, there won't be 98 screaming Dog fans in there this Saturday, but just the lure of playing between the hedges, seeing the hedges and seeing the stadium. Now being able to see that flag flying, the national champ flag, that's going to bring a different feel to the whole stadium scrimmage. And for the guys who haven't played in that environment, it's a little different. It's even going to be different without the fans. So those guys now have to put your resume on tape, like I said. Now show the coaches that now on a Dog Saturday with screaming fans, you can handle playing in that stadium, and it's just fun. This is what you sign up for. This is what college football is all about. It's not your high school stadium. This is Sanford Stadium between the hedges, and that means a lot to a lot of these guys.
You and I talked a good bit about Jalen Carter last week, to move on to the Georgia defense for a moment, and I think there's more evidence out here that, Terrence, while a guy like you who follows the game closely knows how good Jalen Carter is, someone like me and virtually every other Georgia fan is very well aware of this too, there is a lot of evidence right now that a lot of people who consider themselves to be pretty plugged into college football, whether it be national writers or fans from kind of outside the bubble of Dog Nation or SEC country, there seems to be, I think, a lack of realization that Jalen Carter was an impact player for Georgia a year ago on a defense that had a lot of eventual first-round picks. And in light of their departure, Jalen Carter can be right there alongside Will Anderson Jr. in the conversation for the nation's best defensive player and the kind of catalyst that can make the Georgia defense in 2022 look a lot like the one from 2021 did. It's almost like people don't quite yet seem to be aware of how good Carter is. Now, we know NFL scouts know that. There were 8 gazillion of them at practice this week. But it seems like there are a lot of folks who may be about to find out that Georgia still has itself a very good defensive lineman despite all they lost from last year's team.
Oh, most definitely. His play got overshadowed by Jordan Davis, and rightfully so. Jordan, was the fan favorite, the best dog. You just look at his Jordan Davis interview just from yesterday about the tape that just went out. So you can see and understand why he was, the fan favorite, and his play, let alone his personality, made him a fan favorite, and it kind of overshadowed what Jalen Carter did last year on that defense. He's a vital part of why we were so good defensively. And now I think people outside of the South going to understand why he's so heavily touted within NFL ranks. I saw this back in high school. We spoke about this last weekend. I think now with the national stage playing against Oregon in the Benz, people are going to see and understand why Jalen Carter is considered to probably be a top 10 pick.
No, I think you're right about that. We also heard a little bit before you joined us from Kirby Smart on the topic of a lot of those freshman defensive backs. And I've said, Terrence, I'm not quite so sure very many programs ever have signed a crop of defensive backs as talented as one that Georgia brought in from last season. And it sort of stands to reason that at least one of those guys probably breaks out at some point in time this year, that you can't have that many elite talents without having someone step up from the crowd. Malachi Stark seems to be a pretty safe bet on that. One of the cornerbacks, like a Jalen Everett or some Singletary, maybe that's a guy you would discuss in that realm too. I mean, we know that Kirby's going to try to dampen those expectations and not get too out in front of praise on something like this. And yet at the same time, it just sort of seems like one of these guys probably will be heard from in a big way before the year is done. I know you did a lot of battle with defensive backs over the course of your football playing career. Is there one of these young incoming freshman defensive backs that you're maybe more impressed with or kind of thinking about more so than the others here at the moment?
Man, I've had opportunity to watch all of their films, and I think each one of them bring a different skill set. I think Singleton is probably the best out of the group for skill set wise. He's long, he's rangy. I think Humphreys out of Texas is probably the fastest out of the three. His catch-up ability is probably rawest out of the three, and I think Dylan Everett is probably the biggest out of the three. So they all three bring a different dynamic to the game, but I love the skill set of all three of them. I think all three of them is going to turn into some really good players. And, I think the best help from the secondary is the front seven. And having talented guys like we have right now, yes, they're young but very talented, but we have a front seven like Georgia has. It's just going to make those guys even better. So I'm just looking for that next guy who's going to step up opposite of Keelan Ringo, and seems like Lassiter is going to be that guy. But I'm very, very happy about the talent that we have in the back end. Yes, probably the weak link right now, not talent-wise, but in experience-wise. I also like the safeties that we brought in as well. So the secondary haul that Georgia brought in this year is unprecedented in my mind of the talent that we do have back there. If all those guys can actually put it together, this will probably be the most talented secondary that we have ever seen in Georgia history. As far as top to bottom talent-wise, I love all these guys' skill sets.
I love that. I love to hear that, Terrence. That's great stuff. I want to ask you one more thing about the defense there as well. One of the things I said a little earlier this week is that maybe my biggest question related to what Georgia's going to be defensively this season is how it replicates the pass rush that it had a year ago. Because for everything that everybody said about the 2021 defense and the historic nature of that defense, the truth is there have been a lot of other defenses, even in the Smart era, that have come pretty close to matching most of the statistical benchmarks that Georgia put forth last year. The one way, though, in which last year's defense for Georgia greatly exceeded anything that had come before that was how it got after quarterbacks. This group a year ago had 49 sacks, whereas in previous year, kind of a low 30s total would have been about what you would have come to expect from the Dogs when it comes to sacking quarterbacks. In your mind, Terrence, how important is that for Georgia to find a way to kind of get back after quarterbacks again this year and get back over that 40 mark, which I've sort of mentioned as kind of a line that's important here? Can you be 40-plus when it comes to sack total? How important is that for you in your mind?
It's very important. But one thing about last year's defense that we had experienced guys in the secondary. So that helps. And can you blitz more with a young secondary? That's one of the things that we will have to watch out for is, do you put those young guys in predicaments that they can't hold up in the back end because we're sending one more defender than they could block? Can we trust that yet? So, I think the sack total should this year be around the same, just with the front seven. But it just all depends on, do Kirby and company trust the back end to hold up once we blitz and leaving areas of the field acceptable. Because once you blitz, there is an open board in every blitz. So now we just have to be able to get to the quarterback so the offense can't find that open area of the field. So I'm curious to see how much we blitz the front seven, and hopefully the back end can hold up.
I think that's really interesting. Let me remind folks, it's our Marlow's Tavern Insider Update with Terrence Edwards right now, and a couple great things going on at Marlow's. One of those I want you to be aware of, a chance to enjoy the convenience and the rewards that come your way when you become a Marlow's Tavern Insider. This is a great club to be a part of. It's very easy to sign up when you download the Marlow's app. You can register right there. You also get $10 off, $30 just for signing up. And if you want to know, what do I get when I'm a Marlow's Tavern Insider? Let me give you some of these features and benefits right now. When you dine at a Marlow's Tavern, you spend at least $15 on food or beverage, you're going to earn a qualified visit. Now, when you get 4 qualified visits, you're going to receive a complimentary entree reward up to $20 on your next visit. And you can redeem that at any of your favorite Marlow's Taverns, including the one right there in your neighborhood. You can also get special offers on your birthday and everything else. So go to and find the Marlow's Tavern app, download that, and take the step towards becoming a Marlow's Tavern Insider today. Of course, we're happy to have Terrence Edwards as our DawgNation Insider here right now. Also, don't forget this, Thursday, September the 1st, we're going to be at the Marlow's in Dunwoody for our big season kickoff event there. Can't wait to have you on hand for that. It starts at 6 p.m. It's going to be a great event, a great way to celebrate DawgNation's return to the upcoming football season, looking ahead to Georgia, Oregon. A lot of fun and surprises on hand for you on all of that, but can't wait to see you Thursday, September the 1st, right there at Marlow's in Dunwoody, at the Marlow's Tavern in the Dunwoody Village Shopping Center. That's 1317 Dunwoody Village Parkway. Hope you'll make plans to be with us there. 6 p.m. starting on Thursday, September 1st. What a night that's going to be. Going to be a great time. All right, Terrence, my last question for you is this. We expect to hear from Georgia offensive coordinator Todd Monken probably today for a press conference, and I think that Monken is such an important figure for Georgia this year because in his 2 years as Georgia offensive coordinator, we've seen big, dramatic improvement over the previous year. That's a real success story that Monken can tell for himself here. But going into year 3, it seems like there's a chance to do even more of that here and maybe be a little bit more a part of the story for why Georgia is back in national championship contention here this season. So my question is, as someone who knows the coaching game, you're a very accomplished coach, former great player at UGA, you put up big stats there. If you could ask Todd Monken a question, or if you kind of think about your own questions about what you hope to see from the Georgia offense here this season, what would be on your mind related to that? What are you curious about when it comes to a Georgia offense that we hope to learn more about when we hear from Monken maybe later on today?
My biggest question, the only question, is how you're going to utilize those 4 big tight ends that you have. I think those guys bring mismatches that just a normal receiver can't bring, just with the size, the speed. I think all those tight ends bring a different dimension to the game. So how are you going to incorporate all those tight ends into the offense and keep them happy and get them the ball? That's probably my one question I would like to ask is, as a play caller, something I have done on a high school level, just being able to have the toys to go out and play with. He has the toys, and those toys are 4 big human beings that can play the game of football.
Terrence, I think that's a really great point to bring up and a great way to close out our conversation here today. Remind folks, speaking about being an accomplished coach, how they can get in touch with you. Terrence Edwards, Wide Receiver Academy. I know you've always got some great things going on and busy on social media, so how can folks find out more about that?
Well, if you're looking to continue to grow as a receiver, I'm only doing it on weekends right now since I do coach high school football, but Saturdays and Sundays, Saturdays before the Georgia game, we will do maintenance. It's not full workouts. It's just continue to develop your footwork, your hand-eye coordination, and your body control. So if you want to continue to grow as the season goes on, you can find me on all social media platforms at Terrence Edwards, Wide Receiver Academy.
Terrence, great stuff. Thanks for your time. We'll look forward to speaking to you again soon here as a part of a Marlow's Tavern Insider Update.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So let me tell you one of the things that always interests me as someone who asks questions sometimes, whether it be in a press conference situation or in an interview situation like that with a guy who played the game. I'm always interested in an answer that comes without hesitation. In other words, it's not the kind of thing that has to be thought about. It's the kind of thing that just feels so true it sort of leaps out. And it was interesting there to ask Terrence, hey, if you could ask Todd Monken any question, what would your question be? If you could find out anything you don't currently know, what would you want to know? And Terrence doesn't hesitate to say, I want to find out how you use all those tight ends. And I think for a lot of Georgia fans, their big question for Monken would be related to the same thing too, because it is seemingly a little bit of an odd chemistry here in that a good portion of Georgia's very best and potentially most dynamic players on offense all seem to rest the tight end position. And we certainly know that Georgia wants a lot of those on the field, almost always maybe playing, or at least frequently playing, in kind of a 2 tight end set, and maybe at times even kind of doing the 3 tight end set, and maybe just for kind of a wink and a nod, maybe eventually having all 4 guys out there at one time, maybe, or even more than that. Obviously, there are other tight ends like Brett Seither and Rylan Goldie who I think would have a chance to also make a name for themselves too if the right situation were to make itself available. But the point is that Georgia is incredibly deep at the tight end spot, and how do you use all those guys effectively? And I've said before that while I think there is potential for almost any of these guys to be good, the reality is it's probably only going to be a couple of guys who really get utilized that way because there are just only so many touches and snaps and opportunities to get the football to go around there. And it kind of remains to be seen, well, who is that guy that joins Brock Bowers among the tight ends most targeted in this Georgia passing attack here this season? But very interesting to hear Terrence Edwards with very little hesitation that of all the questions facing Monken right now, that one stood out as the most interesting to him. And I think we should all pay attention to that too as we get ready to hear Todd Monken a little bit later on today. For now, though, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean and remind you, whether it's one of those 3 or 4 night trips on the Bahamas, going to Perfect Day Coco Cay, or whether it's a 7-night sailing on one of these big Oasis-class ships, whatever Royal Caribbean cruise vacation feels right for you, there is still a chance for you to take advantage of some great savings on all of that. I'm talking about when it comes to that kids sail free promotion that Royal Caribbean's running right now, and I'm talking about that 30% off all cruiser sale that's been going on there too. So Royal Caribbean really enticing you to take advantage of a great time to be back on the seas again, and a great opportunity to enjoy all the ports that Royal Caribbean visits, all the great amenities on board the terrific Royal Caribbean cruise ships. This is a time to take advantage of that with really as good a sale as you're going to find. Kids sail free, 30% off all cruisers. This is available to you right now. Reach out to our friends, the Cruise and Vacation Authority. You can find them online at tcava.com. That's tcava.com. Or you can give them a call, 770-952-8300. That's 770-952-8300. You can check all of that out today. Our friends there are going to help you get booked up with a great price on a great experience, a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. I've got 2 of them coming up after the football season is done, and many of you are making those same kind of plans right now. But make sure you do it with the great savings opportunity that's available to you from our friends at Royal Caribbean. All right, let's go bouncing around here. And a little bit of injury talk here off the top. Florida suffering, one of its top wide receivers suffering a foot injury, Ricky Pearsall. That kind of leaves him out indefinitely for the moment. You're going to hear me mention another foot injury here in a second. And this is one of those things where it seems like this time of year we hear more about foot injuries than maybe any other portion of the year, and maybe almost like more of these sort of foot injuries than almost any other kind of injury. He had a lot of those last year for Georgia too, and there's always, I believe, kind of an incorrect, I guess, temptation that pops in on all of this to say, well, what's wrong if so-and-so program's having these injuries? And some even Georgia fans were like, why is my favorite team dealing with foot injuries last year? And there's a thing that wants to go on where you got to find somebody to blame for it. But honestly, I'm just not quite so sure, what you do about that. You're going to hear multiple foot injuries today. You're going to hear multiple of those. You run through the month of August. And I don't really know how Pearsall hurt himself, but the fact of the matter is when you got big guys wearing cleats and they're all standing close together and they're working on getting their timing and rhythm down, the potential for injury is pretty great. And for Florida here, pretty early on in the first camp for Billy Napier, the new coach, you're kind of dealing with what you don't want to be dealing with, which is an injury to a pretty important player. And in the case of Pearsall, this might end up being, especially if he were to be fully healthy, this might end up being the most valuable pass-catching target for quarterback Anthony Richardson here this year. A lot of the story for Florida this offseason has been around building confidence in Richardson, building confidence in the players around Richardson that he is the guy, something that Dan Mullen never seemed to buy into. Billy Napier has tried to recast that as Anthony Richardson's our guy at quarterback. He was brought to SEC Media Days, and they're trying to make him the focal point of the team. Well, if you're Richardson, you got to have somebody to throw to, and Pearsall was supposed to be that guy. Maybe eventually he is that. But in the early stage of the season, they could be in some trouble here. He's out indefinitely. That's the description. So we don't know how long that is, but we do know this. Important early season games for Florida against Utah, against Kentucky. The LSU game kind of looms there. The Tennessee game kind of looms there. Whether it be the Pearsall injury or some other injury that pops up, these are kind of razor-thin margin, sort of coin toss type games, and you sort of keep those in mind, how injuries can swing the balance there. Sometimes we have a tendency to overrate the impact of a single injury in a college football team, but for Florida, knowing they're going to be playing so many close games early, or at least games that are expected to be close, a fully healthy slate of players is a pretty important part of making sure they give themselves the best chance to win on that. The Pearsall injury does not help anything. We have a little bit more of an idea about another injured wide receiver, JoJo Earl from Alabama. This is another one of those big signees from the class of 2021. Earl was like a top 50 national recruit, so to speak, around that variety. So this is a pretty big-time recruit at the receiver position. Also one of the guys that Alabama hopes to kind of have step in this year in place of a lot of guys that Alabama lost from a season ago. But Earl also dealing with a little bit of a foot thing here right now too. Going to keep him out for, I think they're saying, at least a month, if not 6 to 8 weeks there on that. So another injury for Alabama at the wide receiver position. I'm not going to joke about this because, we don't really joke about, player injuries necessarily. But for an Alabama program, they've just had a lot of these. And as we've said before, when you put so much of your program's identity on the basis of quarterback throwing to wide receivers, you better hope none of them get hurt, because it becomes a whole lot harder to be what you want to be. And, Earl's by far, far from the only elite, potentially talented wide receiver Alabama has. This is also an injury of note there for the Crimson Tide there as well. Nick Saban talked about that this week. So Earl, another receiver in the SEC, going to be on the shelf there for a little while. I thought that Tom Fornelli had an interesting piece at CBSSports.com, to transition here for a moment, about what he calls his chaos teams around college football, the kinds of teams that could really sort of mess up the season-long narratives that were in place. And the two SEC teams that got mentioned, one being Shane Beamer and the South Carolina Gamecocks, the other being the Auburn Tigers. Now, when you think about like the potential for both the Gamecocks and the Tigers to be sort of teams that add to the overall chaos of the season, one of the reasons why South Carolina would have a chance to do this is because of the schedule they play. They get a chance to play Georgia at home. They host Georgia. They'll get a chance to play Clemson at the end of the season. They've got a quarterback in Spencer Rattler that seemingly gives you a little bit of a puncher's chance in a lot of the games you would be playing, a chance to pull that upset. South Carolina also goes on the road to Arkansas. That's kind of an interesting game out of the SEC West. That Shane Beamer, if he does build on what he did in year one, they could have a say in who makes it to Atlanta for the SEC championship game, or who makes it into the college football playoff, especially from the standpoint of Clemson that's trying to claw their way back into that discussion. The Gamecocks themselves, not quite good enough yet to be SEC East contenders, but they could have a say in how the rest of the postseason shakes out. That's probably true. That's also probably true for Auburn there as well. Auburn has the lowest projected season win total in the SEC West. Most of the major sports books have it at just 5.5, but they're also above the so-called blue chip ratio threshold that Bud Elliott writes about at 247sports.com. 54% of their signees over the course of the last 4 years have been either 4- or 5-star recruits. So technically, by the thinnest, barest of margins, they make the sort of bare minimum amount of former blue chip recruits necessary to be a national championship contender. We sort of know that's not really what Auburn is, but they have recruited better than a lot of other teams have. And you can kind of easily imagine, well, what if Zach Calzada, who seems to have the inside track on winning that quarterback job, what if he ends up being a little bit more like the version of himself that played very well against Alabama, and a lot less like the version of Zach Calzada that played in almost every other game last season? What if you paired good quarterback with overall relatively high amount of talent, even for a team that's not expected to win very many games. At that point in time, Auburn does become dangerous. Once again, they play Georgia, they play Alabama. They almost beat Alabama a year ago with a team that was really pretty bad, all things considered, that they could be one of those teams that could insert some chaos into the college football season. And I would say that, and you've heard me say this before, but I'd say this again about any of those SEC West teams, Auburn to a small degree, teams like LSU, Texas A&M to a larger degree, and even a little bit of a Florida thing on this too, that if you've got more than half your roster that is former 4- and 5-star signees, which all those teams I just mentioned do, in the case of LSU, they're above 60%. In the case of A&M, they're almost, I think, right at 70%. If any of those teams finds quarterback, once again, they become a lot more of a stumbling block for an Alabama or maybe even a Georgia about making the college football playoff. That if any of the teams I just mentioned can find a true signal caller, and it's not obvious they will. In fact, it may be a safe bet they won't. Certainly in the case of A&M, they've had a hard time doing that. Maybe Max Johnson changes that. LSU has brought in a guy like Jaden Daniels in from Arizona State, but part of the reason he left Arizona State is he hasn't shown you in the recent times the kind of level of moxie and success that he showed when he was a true freshman. At this point, Jaden Daniels just may not be very good. And, of course, Auburn's got its own quarterback issues there too. But if any of those teams that have a relatively high overall, level of talent on the roster, you pair quarterback with that talent, you could be looking at a team that's at least good enough to make some noise, if not quite good enough to contend on their own. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. All right. So here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, let's turn our attention back to the Dogs fully here for a moment, and let's talk about what has been a little bit of an odd conversation over the course of the last 24 hours or so, kind of coming out right around the time we were starting yesterday's show and kind of bubbling up a lot in the time since then, about the idea that Georgia, as the designated home team for this year's Georgia-Florida game, is going to get a chance to host recruits. And this has been treated as a very big deal and sort of been treated as no deal at all. And I think the overall truth here is probably something not quite necessarily in the middle, but while I would agree that it's not as big a deal as it's been sort of projected to be or suggested that it will be, it's also not completely insignificant either. Now, my understanding on this is, and a lot of this stuff's pretty complicated, but by rule, Georgia and Florida have been allowed to have tickets for recruits at this game since 2012. That's when the rule was changed to make this possible. But both sides have sort of chosen not to. And if we had to guess, a lot of this was probably about money because those tickets can't be sold. And so if you can sell the ticket, then if the whole reason you're going to Jacksonville anyway is because of money, then maximize the money you have a chance to make, which means selling every ticket you can and not holding back some and giving them to recruits. And so now, apparently, that's going to change with Georgia this year. They're going to hold on to some tickets, and they're going to give some of them to recruits. And you're going to imagine, because this is not an official visit, you're not flying there on Georgia's dime. You're going to travel on your own to get there. So this is probably, North Florida, South Georgia type recruits, somewhere on that 75 corridor. Those are the folks that can kind of easily get to Jacksonville for this, heading over towards I-95, whatever else. These are the kinds of recruits that will likely be there. And, being able to call these folks up, these recruits, and say, hey, would you like to come to the Georgia-Florida game? We can get you tickets. There's probably some value to this. It is not the same level of value as being able to host that guy on your campus, and he's on the sidelines before the game, and he's having a lot of contact with Georgia coaches and staffers. You can't have any of that contact in Jacksonville. So this isn't as big a deal as some have portrayed it to be, I don't believe, but it's also not a completely insignificant deal either. It's probably something that should have been done prior to this. I guess good that Georgia's finally doing it. I remember being on the field last year before the Georgia-Clemson game, and I was sort of used to no recruits being in stadiums at all. But last year for the Georgia-Clemson game, or at least not officially, in the stadium, sometimes, folks will kind of find their way in. But last year there was, I remember being on the field, a little bit of drama related to, hey, Georgia and Clemson were both giving tickets to recruits, and there was some curiosity among some of the recruiting reporters about who was going to sit in the Georgia section and who was going to sit in the Clemson section. And I sort of remember a little bit of chatter related to that making a bunch of tickets available to recruits is something that Georgia definitely wanted to do. It recruits, obviously, the state of North Carolina pretty regularly. I think Clemson, Clemson just likes for things to be as easy as possible in recruiting. I don't think they were looking forward to, handling all the logistics of making a bunch of tickets available to a bunch of people. If you've ever had to get tickets for somebody, you know how hard that can kind of be. And I don't think the Clemson side was quite as excited about all of this. But, this is something I think that Georgia used to its advantage a year ago, giving tickets to recruits for a neutral site game like the Georgia-Clemson game. That was the understanding I got from talking to some people about this. And now being able to do some version of that for the Georgia-Florida game probably is at least worth something. I don't think it changes overall what Kirby wants here, which the game played home and home. In fact, at SEC Media Days, going back a few weeks ago, back in the month of July, Smart, in a debate on television with former Florida quarterback Tim Tebow, was about as clear on this as one can be. Let me give you a snippet of this as a reminder from the SEC Network. Kirby making the case for getting out of Jacksonville for good. This was from July.
How come you want to switch it up?
Why is it one of the best environments? How many times did you play in Athens now?
None.
How many times did we get to play in Gainesville?
None.
I think that's special.
It is.
I think that's special.
But you get a lot of home and road games, but you only get one where it's split 50-50
No, you
in the
don't.
middle.
We're going to play Oregon this year in Mercedes.
I know, and there'll be pockets full of it, but this one's literally split right down the middle. Orange and blue, red and black.
It absolutely is. I tell you what, y'all tell Florida you call the AD and you ask him to come to Atlanta and come play us. We'll play in Atlanta anytime they want to play.
I feel like it's more of an advantage for Florida than...
It's not an advantage for anybody. You look at the history of it. The team with the better players and the better team usually wins that game, and it affects the outcome of the SEC East. It's more about, for me, I'm competing against guys all across the SEC who host kids at their biggest game.
So that's Smart there on that. He wants the game home and home. He thinks it benefits recruiting. There are a lot of Georgia fans who agree with him, or there's just a lot of Georgia fans that are kind of ready for this to be home and home too. That's something I'm gladly acknowledge, even though I'm sort of pro-cocktail party. I'll also acknowledge that in addition to some fans who just want the game to be home and home, there are some fans who don't really care, but they kind of want whatever Kirby Smart wants. That's another constituency here, that if Kirby wants it, it's good enough for them. I completely acknowledge that too. The reality of the situation, though, is it's going to take more than just Kirby's opinion to change this game, whether that should be true or not true. There's more considerations here than just what Kirby wants. That's just kind of the reality of the situation. So maybe we do see the dissolution of this tradition, a cocktail party, a thing that I really enjoy. Maybe it is about to go away because a lot of stuff in college football seems to be changing. The SEC's overall schedule is about to change greatly, and maybe that change means this has to change. Maybe that's the case. But if it does change, you don't have to wonder how Kirby Smart feels about it. He's pretty clear right there on television, going back to SEC Media Days, that this is a change that he wants to see. So with that, we'll wrap up today's show. And we'll remind you that wherever Georgia-Florida is played, in Jacksonville, in Athens, and that, dump that is Gainesville, wherever it is, a good Georgia fan will always be a Gator hater first and foremost. And so with that, we celebrate that to close out our show, including giving out a couple of golden shoes here today as we have a good time here. And Brian Whitehead, speaking of Alabama excuses, there have been a lot of those, bringing back an oldie but a goodie, the no excuses sign, marked out the just some excuses, but only if we lose. Brian Whitehead asking me if I made that. I did not make it, but I certainly agree with the sentiment expressed from the meme there. So good stuff from Brian Whitehead. Also, speaking of our friends at Marlow's Tavern, where we'll be on September 1st, our buddy Simone Cartwell checks in to say, I'm chilling at Marlow's Tavern right now. Wonderful sponsor, the greatest podcast anywhere in the world. DawgNation Daily and DawgNation. He says, go Dogs. And how about that New York strip? Cheers, he says, enjoying himself and having a good time. Simone, I'm glad about that and thankful for you for sharing all of that. We'll give you a golden shoe, too. And we'll remind you, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, wherever their games are played, they have an inglorious history following behind them. 4,963 days since they've won a national championship. And our Gator Hater countdown, 79 days from right now. Georgia back in Jacksonville, beaten up on those lousy, stinking Gators again. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that today. All right, I'm going to pop over here and do some YouTube comments first. And we'll kind of flow through the rest of the comments. I'll also remind you, if your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. So find them online at rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. G. Greg's Bama Boy says, I see Kirby's point, but it's political. I mean, look, here's the one thing I think to kind of keep in mind here. And G. Grace, a Bama fan, and I wonder how much of this is true for Bama. Like, the University of Georgia is located in Athens. But Athens is not the epicenter of Dog Nation. It's just not. That it's not like the overwhelming majority of Georgia fans in Sanford Stadium are driving 20 minutes to get to the stadium. They're just not. Atlanta area folks are driving an hour and a half. Middle Georgia folks are driving 3 hours. People down there in Valdosta and other side of the state over Moultrie, places like that, they're driving 5 hours, right? I mean, 4.5 at least. Savannah, Georgia is just a very big state, and a lot of Georgia support. Athens is already a road game for them. So that's important to remember here, that for a lot of the supporters, the Jacksonville game is their home game. That's the one that's the game they view that's close for them. It's a little bit like Arkansas in that respect. Arkansas historically has played a game every year in Little Rock because that's where a lot of Arkansas folks live. When you go to the state of Arkansas and you get to Little Rock, you're still 2.5 hours northwest to get to Fayetteville. Fayetteville is just kind of way up in the northwest corner of the state. A lot of the folks in the population center are kind of there around Little Rock. So historically, the Razorbacks have kind of played a game right there in War Memorial Stadium. Now, I think that Sam Pittman's trying to change that, and he probably eventually will. Arkansas actually doesn't play very many SEC home games. They're trying to fix that. But at Georgia, there's just a little bit of a consideration on the fact that there are already a lot of people traveling to go to a lot of Georgia games anyway, and the Jacksonville game's just, one more example of that. Howard Eubank says Jacksonville is a nightmare. Stationed there for 3 years in the Navy, Athens is better. Kind of reminds me of my grandfather on my dad's side. So he was a World War II era veteran, and he was also stationed in Florida for a time too. And for the rest of his life, he'd never go back to Florida. And this is not like an anti-Gator thing. This is like he just didn't like where he was stationed. I forget what base he was in. He was in the Army. I forget what base that he was in. But the entire time my dad was growing up, they always went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. They would not go to Florida for vacation. Didn't travel to Florida at all. My grandparents were big campers for a while. They would, they'd camp around, but never in Florida. They'd camp in Carolinas. They'd camp Tennessee. They'd go, places like that. They'd go around Georgia. They would not go to Florida. So for some reason, what you're saying there reminds me of my grandfather, who just did not like that. Jerry Dog Fan says, that's why I want Florida State in the SEC East. About an hour drive from Moultrie, I've made the trek to Athens. Yeah, a lot of folks don't realize how close Florida State fans and Georgia fans live to each other down there in that sort of southwest corner of the state, where Thomasville is, Moultrie is, kind of that Albany area a little bit too. You just don't realize how close Bainbridge, where Kirby's from, that part of the state is just kind of really kind of close to a lot of Florida State fans. I guess Bainbridge a little bit less, but the point is that's one of the reasons why in future years, Georgia's supposed to be playing Florida State in some non-conference games. And I hope those still happen, because those are the kinds of regional rivalries that I think should be taking place. You say maybe one day in the SEC East, or maybe as an SEC team, and maybe Florida State will be in the SEC one day. But I always kind of find myself thinking from the standpoint of, well, who should Georgia schedule for its non-conference games? There is sort of one thought here that it's good to schedule out of region games, the Michigans, the Ohio States, the used to be Texases before Texas joined the SEC or made plans to join the SEC, that folks wanted to go there, like Georgia went to Notre Dame in 2017. And I like doing that. I really do. I love the travel. I love seeing Georgia fans travel as much as they do. But there's also something for me around the idea of a regional rivalry. I love the idea of Georgia playing Clemson, something I grew up seeing Georgia do, something, growing up seeing Georgia playing South Carolina every year as a non-SEC team back when I was a kid. And frankly, when you think about how close Tallahassee is to the sort of the southwest corner of the state of Georgia, you commonly have high school teams from that part of the state of Florida playing up into Georgia in the early sort of pre-region part of the year. When you have that going on the way that it does, Georgia and Florida State probably should play more frequently. Now, there's only 12 games. You can't play everybody as much as you want to, but doing a little more Georgia-Florida State probably does make some sense. Let me get a couple more here. I'm going to bounce out. Let's see what else. Kirby's visor talking about that 316 travel. For a lot of folks coming that Atlanta area to go to Athens, that 316 can be a nightmare. I think it's better now than it used to be, but boy, it's tough sometimes. Jonathan Aaron said, if I made the call, would Georgia have 3 tight ends on the field at all time? So this is why I think what Kirby Smart said the other day was really interesting, that Kearis Jackson plays an important role on Georgia because, as kind of a slot guy, things like that, putting him in the game means you're taking one of those tight ends off the field. And that's a pretty interesting way to think about Georgia's personnel, that do you want more tight ends, do you want more wide receivers? Given what I think of the Georgia tight end room compared to the other position groups, I want as many tight ends on the field as I can, I believe. But I'd love for this to be true. Whether it's Kearis or maybe Don Blaylock in a similar role or whoever else, I'd love to see a Georgia receiver play so well, or maybe just the group playing so well at all overall, that you kind of rethink the notion of you've got to have a bunch of tight ends in the game because that's where Georgia's most talent is situated on offense. Wouldn't you love the idea of wide receivers playing so well that all of a sudden now you didn't feel quite as much of an obligation to have a bunch of tight ends in the game? Maybe it doesn't happen. I think at least one of the Georgia wide receivers probably breaks out pretty good. But overall, I mean, I think the Georgia tight ends are still so talented that you want a lot of them involved in the game plan. But it would be nice to think that you didn't feel like you had to have 3 in the game because you felt really good about what the Georgia wide receivers were doing. Let me go to Facebook for a moment. Boy, I've got like 80 million tabs open up on my computer here too. So let's see if I can find one to use here and go over to Facebook and take some comments over there. And I hope you're all doing great. On Facebook, Philip Jordan Wells says, for real, how many UGA fans are top fans on any Bama feed? They watch our show every single day. So pretty funny stuff. Sandy Price says that Jim Donnan said that a couple of the NFL scouts who were at the practice the other day said that UGA was the gold standard, including the NFL, was the way to conduct a practice. That's the ultimate compliment to any coach. Yeah, I mean, go back and listen to what Howie Roseman, the Philadelphia Eagles GM, said on a local radio interview up there about drafting Kobe Dean and drafting Jordan Davis, that he essentially viewed it as kind of a one-stop shop. Like, that's what Roseman said, not to, like, Georgia folks, but to, like, Philadelphia folks about why they drafted Dean, why they drafted Davis, and why they spent so much time around Athens during the pre-draft process. That kind of tells you all you need to know. Ken Holcomb says the recruits need to see the fancy UGA facilities in the town of Athens with all those pretty girls, not Jacksonville. It is definitely true that the on-campus experience sells the program better than Jacksonville does. But let me give you kind of one more thing on this, and I don't mean to get too deep in the weeds here. But a lot of you are salespeople. That's what you do for a living. And there is a huge correlation between good recruiting and good sales tactics. And like, the best way to be a good salesperson is just stay in constant contact with your prospects. And the best way to stay in constant contact, a lot of times the salespeople that work for DawgNation that sell our great sponsorships, including Merriweather and Tharp, you see behind me, one of the things they talk about a lot are what they call, this is a very sort of, businessy type thing to say, but they call them VBRs, VBR, which stands for valid business reason. That, and if you're a salesperson, you understand this, that the best thing in the world to have is a valid business reason for picking up the phone and dialing. Hey, just want to let you know, we got a, for instance, Royal Caribbean. Hey, we got, kids sale free right now. If you want to book a cruise, it's a great time to do it because kids sale free. That's a valid business reason to call somebody. And recruiting kind of works the same way. Like, I heard from one time a story about an offensive coordinator who came to college football from the NFL. And he, as the offensive coordinator, is leading the staff meeting. And he looked down, all of his coaches are sitting there doing this the entire time. And he said, what are you guys doing? Get off your phones and pay attention. And the coaches, who had been in college sports for a lot longer than he had been, looked up at him and said, we're talking to recruits. This is our job. It's like, we have to be in this meeting, but we got to stay on this phone and connect to recruits. That's really what a good position coach especially, but just recruiter in general does. They find a way to be in constant contact with the recruits they're pursuing, and having a good reason to reach out to them just makes those conversations easier to have. So when you do have the opportunity of a visit, it's not just what happens while you're on campus. It's the opportunity for connection that makes before the visit, and then after the visit. Did you have a good time? What did you think about it? Blah, blah, blah. These are valid business reasons for reaching out to a recruit around a visit. And so that's why the presence of tickets for the Georgia-Florida game is not a zero. There's at least some value to it because, once again, it kind of gives you a valid business reason to reach out to the recruit and say, hey, would you like some tickets to the Georgia-Florida game? They say yes. Okay, good. This becomes an easy contact. Salespeople call this a touch point. This becomes an easy touch point for the recruit, and you better believe coaches understand that. After the game, did you come? Did you meet anybody? What'd you do? What'd you think? How bad is Florida? Don't they suck? All that stuff becomes just easy touch points for recruits, and that's really how the business of recruiting gets done. This is why some coaches are thought to be good recruiters and some coaches are thought to be bad recruiters. Because there are some people, just the same way that not every salesperson is equally successful, there are some people who just have a hard time making natural connections. They just seem really awkward, or they just are too introverted, or whatever else. They just have a hard time connecting. The best recruiters are good at making connections, and they make those connections frequently, and visits and free tickets and things like that just make it easier to have a reason to reach out and connect. So that's kind of a long answer to a short question, but nonetheless. Now, let me get Walter Pagel here, who says, when you were at practice, do you ever see Kirby using referees during scrimmages to try to get rid of stupid penalties before the season starts? Yeah. So there's a group of officials that go to every Georgia practice, and they are some of the best dudes you'll ever meet. They are such nice guys, just out there doing this. They're even allowed to travel with Georgia. I remember back in Pasadena, they traveled out there, and they worked during practice and things like that. They'll be there Saturday for the regular scrimmage. I mean, they're always at every scrimmage every practice I ever go to, and I'm assuming that means they must always be at every practice, and they're just great dudes, just good, solid dudes, really fun, and they work very hard to try to do exactly what you say, which is get Georgia up to speed. I love people who love the game, and you meet a lot of folks, kind of whether it be officials or coaches, things like that, who just love the game and love being a part of it, and kind of dedicated their life to the sport, and that's what these guys sort of are. And so, yeah, they are present at every practice I've ever been to. Doug Rayburn says, A.D. Mitchell's my breakout receiver, and maybe Arian. Yeah, if we're betting on who's going to be Georgia's leading receiver as a wide receiver, A.D. Mitchell would be my guy. But Arian Smith, if we're passing out sort of preseason superlatives, here's my preseason superlative for Arian. I believe A.D. Mitchell's a very good pick to maybe be Georgia's leading receiver among the wide receivers. I think that Arian Smith might be a pretty good bet for the most dynamic catch of any Georgia player at any point in time during the season. I think that might be the case. Arian Smith might be a pretty good bet for that, of course, if he can stay healthy. Barry Watkins also shouting out Jackson Meeks. We do hear that from time to time. Gerald Herman says Nakobe Dean should not have fallen to the third round. I do agree with you on that. John Foster says, I work in sales and don't even like answering the phone when they call. When they call me, he says, I probably wouldn't be a great recruiter. Yeah, you do just have to be really comfortable doing that kind of thing. You have to be constantly connected. And I'm telling you, it's constantly connected in meetings all the time. And a lot of this is it's not phone calls as much anymore because that's kind of how youth culture sort of evolved. It's, it's texts and DMs and things like that. But it is nonstop. John Foster having some fun with that. Barry Watkins says Brian Harson's going to be gone mid-season. Could very well be true. Matt Rukavina says Florida only leaves the state 4 times this year. What a crock. I did not realize that, but that's an interesting stat for sure. So Matt Rukavina is going to be in Disney the week of the Tennessee game. Any recommendations to watch the game that Saturday? Where is a good place in Disney to watch the game? That's a good question. There used to be like an ESPN Zone type place at the Disney Boardwalk, but it's now closed. Let me think about that. Ask me again. Let me see if I can give you a better answer, because I want to give you a good answer for this. It's probably somewhere in Disney Springs, but I'm trying to think of a place that's got a lot of TVs. Ask me again, and I'll see if I can give you a better answer for that, because I want to make sure I give you a good one. Sam Burke says, I see our spreading out defenses like Bama with receivers. He says X is Mitchell, Y is Gilbert, slot's going to be Jackson, tight end Washington, running back Bowers. That allows Bowers to take the James Cook role and end up one-on-one with the linebacker. That'd be a tough formation to stop. That would definitely be a tough formation to stop, no doubt about that. Let's go to DawgNation.com for a minute. West GA Dog fans says Coach Rick's going to be speaking at the First Baptist Church in Villa Rica tonight at 7 p.m. Doors open at 6. It's a free event. First of all, you can tell where I grew up, because when I see FBC, I did not hesitate to know what that abbreviation stood for. So there you go. That gives you an idea of kind of how I grew up and where I grew up. But in all honesty, that is an awesome experience. I'd love to hear Coach Rick. I just pray for that guy. I hope he stays in good health. And I know he's battling a tough thing with the Parkinson's right now, but my understanding is he's still going to be on TV this fall. I think still working for the ACC network, I believe, and still obviously making these public appearances and speaking. We got to protect him at all costs, because he's a valuable resource for us, for sure. Randy Hall on the subject of Tyke Smith. Yeah, I wonder about Tyke. You mentioned, playing a dime type position. Georgia didn't get to do a lot of dime a year ago, I don't think. I just kind of wonder about Tyke. What kind of top end speed is he going to show? And, maybe that's why, if they're thinking of him in a little bit more of a run stop role or something like that, that might be kind of what that's, sort of related to. But I wonder about Tyke. Could have a great season for Georgia. Certainly seems like he's working his way back to health, hopefully. But, we'll have to see. At one point in time, this was treated like a very big deal when he arrived as a transfer. How big of a deal is that still? I have to admit, I'm curious to see. J-Bob says 3 tight ends should be the exception, not the rule. 2 will force the other team to put a second safety. 3 will have the number of wide receivers. That's kind of the case, but J-Bob, and I meant to do this as a show topic, and maybe eventually I might. So earlier this summer, I made the case that why not just treat Brock Bowers as a wide receiver? And I kind of got roasted for it a little bit. I mean, every now and then it's probably good that I get roasted. I probably need to be every now and then. But I sort of got roasted for this a little bit. But did you see that Brock Bowers, I believe, is on the watch list for the Biletnikoff Award as the nation's best wide receiver? Now, you don't have to be on the watch list to win the award, and the watch list itself is not worth very much. But the point here is that if 3 tight ends are on the field and one of those is Bowers, I don't know that really counts as 3 tight ends. So, I mean, I really do. What does Brock Bowers do differently than a wide receiver? I mean, at this point in time, I really think he should be basically a wide receiver, and I think you'd almost be covered like one. So I get the point you're making. You don't want Georgia to be, 3 yards and cloud of dust type offense. That's what 3 tight ends sort of feels like. But honestly, watch the Patriots. Watch how many times they throw out of not always a 3 tight end set, but that's one of those teams that's very aggressive out of throwing out of a 2 tight end set. That in the NFL, smart teams put 2 tight ends on the field, make teams think, run, and then throw out of a kind of a heavy formation. That's just what good NFL teams have done for a long time. Look at the way in which, Kyle Shanahan does some similar stuff with the fullback. If college team brought out a fullback today, it'd feel like 1983. But in the NFL, a lot of teams use fullbacks to great effect, and they throw with fullbacks in the game. That's just kind of the way that goes. Somebody's calling me Brandon the 13th man Adam, saying the over-under for A&M is 7.5. What do you got? But it's not 7.5, is it? It's 8.5, isn't it? Isn't the over-under for A&M 8.5? Am I wrong about this? Is it really 7.5? I mean, if it's 7.5, that to me is probably a fairly easy over. I have a hard time imagining A&M loses 5 games. If it's 8.5, though, that's a tougher decision. And this is where I don't mind joining some of you who are pretty critical of the Aggies. I don't mind telling you that it's going to be hard for this team to kind of break through that kind of 8-4 threshold. Certainly getting past 9-3, hard to do. They haven't won 10 games yet under Jimbo Fisher. And so for a lot of our audience that thinks that Fisher's an overrated coach, that's your ammunition right there. They haven't won the 10 games yet. I don't see them winning 10 games this year, probably, just given the overall depth of the SEC West. But I don't believe the number's 7.5, although you may be right. Let's see what else. BA's listing face says that he's not going to bring up the fact that Athens just smells nicer than Jacksonville. There's no doubt that that's true. Jacksonville does not smell very good. And, like, Jacksonville's just not very nice. The stadium's not nice. It's an NFL stadium, but it's not nice at all. Like, my love for the cocktail party is, to be frank, sort of related to the cocktails. You know, whether it be, St. Simon's or Amelia Island, these places, I think it's kind of cool to go to the beach in the fall. I think that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do. Now, I'm also in a stage of my life now where I don't get a lot of cocktail party around my cocktail party. It's kind of an in and out type deal for me. I'm in one day and out the next. I'm not really doing, because I work on Friday nights. So I'm not getting a big long weekend out of all this the way that some of y'all are. But if I could, I would. And I do enjoy it. So if it's one man, one vote, my vote would be for the cocktail party. You know, if I could influence somebody else to vote the same way, I would try to do that. Am I aware of the growing sentiment of some Georgia fans to make it home and home? I kind of am. And if the majority of them felt that way, I'd want them to have what they want. So you are right. It does smell nicer. I mean, Jacksonville as a town is not a very nice town. The surrounding area is super nice. I love Amelia Island. I love Jacksonville Beach. You kind of get over towards St. Augustine. That's really great there as well. Like Jacksonville itself, the city proper, most people could kind of leave it. The area around it, I'll take it any day of the week. Any day of the week. Let's see what else. What else is going on? Cat Story says the article I read the other day referenced Georgia practices. I guess it was Darian Kendrick saying that the season games are easy because of the harder practices. Yeah, the toughest team that Georgia will play in Sanford Stadium this year is the team they're going to play on Saturday. I mean, that's just a fact. Georgia playing itself in a scrimmage is the hardest game that will take place between the hedges this year. It just is. No disrespect to Tennessee, but that is just a fact. And it does make you better because of that. I mean, this is one of those things. Sometimes, we maybe oversimplify certain things, but this is as true as it seems like it would be. When you play against players at practice, I mean, ask John Stinchcomb about battling Richard Seymour, or battling Charles Grant, or battling some of the guys that he battled. When you were competing against those guys every single day, you are either going to thrive or you're not going to survive as a player. You'll either find out that, hey, this just isn't for me. It is a self-selection process. I can either handle it or I can't. And, I just don't think we ever fully understand what it's like to go through all this in these days leading up to it. And Kirby's, right. He pointed this out last week. There are no more two-a-days and things like that. So the actual, true grind's not what it once was. But when you come out here and you push your body beyond what you thought of its physical limits, and then you wake up and have to try to do it all over again the next day again, and then the day after that, and the day after that, the level of mental commitment that requires is sometimes beyond what we can even imagine. Doggy says I should stop being a Jack's cheerleader. It's more than a little obvious. I'm not trying to be objective. I'm not even pretending to be objective. I'm being very clear that if I had my way, you'd keep the game in Jacksonville. Now, I'm also gracious enough to concede that if more people felt the opposite than not, I'd be fine with the majority having their say on all of that. But I'm not doing an objective show. I didn't fight and claw my way to get the show to play it straight right down the middle. I did so I can express my opinion. My opinion is the cocktail party is a really cool thing. I hope it stays. But me hoping it alone is not enough to keep it. Let's see what else. Let me go to YouTube again. This will be our final trip around the comment section. And what was supposed to be all right, very quick here. Kirby's Visors got the Utes 38-31 over the Gators. That's a pretty fun early season game. But y'all just be careful with this. Be careful with this. We don't ever see these non-conference teams beat SEC foes on a neutral site situation. Like in Dallas and in Charlotte and in Atlanta in all these stadiums where all these neutral site games get played, SEC versus Big Ten or ACC or Pac-12, we never see the SEC lose in those situations. That's a neutral site. Florida's playing Utah in Gainesville. This is a different kind of deal than a lot of these week 1, week 2, non-conference type affairs. I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment if you think that Utah, I don't care if they're preseason top 10. I don't care if they win the Pac-12. The week of the game, Florida's going to be the point spread favorite in that game. Hear me now, believe me later. Florida's going to be the point spread favorite. I said the other day, Florida should win that game. This is still the Pac-12. So nobody wants to see Florida lose every game it plays, more so than me. But don't get set up for disappointment on this. Utah may go 11-1, but their loss, they're going to be expected to lose to Florida. They're traveling a long way away to play in a hostile stadium. That's not an easy spot for Utah. They'll do fine against Pac-12 competition, but I'm not quite so sure they're ready for this. I'm not quite so sure they're ready for this. Let's Go Brandon says, BA, let the haters know our new guys don't have to be as good as who they replace to be absolutely elite. It's totally true, Let's Go. You're right about this. And I've said this over and over again. The goal is not to match and be as good as 2021. The goal is to be, on defense, as good as you need to be in 2022. And could Georgia have the very best defense in the country this season? Yes, it could. It is absolutely in the conversation right now to be that unit. And will Georgia be in a good position at the end of the season if it has the nation's best defense? Yes, it will. Like this idea that you better get ready for disappointment. You better get ready to not be what you were last year. I mean, maybe in a relative sense, based on degrees of difference, but in terms of an overall kind of season-long story, honestly, I don't see right now why this season would need to look all that much different than last season did. An offense that scores about 40, a defense that gives up about 10, that's going to win most of the games that you play. It just is. Or even if it's 17. What if Georgia gives up 17 points per game this year? It's almost a full touchdown more than it gave up a year ago. What if it does that? How many games you losing if you allow 17 points? Last year wouldn't have been very many. Worm says the truth is Bama didn't get better since January 10th. So I don't mind telling you this. This is one of the things I do think is going to be interesting to see. Bama either got way better because they brought in a bunch of transfers, or they just became way different. They have a lot of component pieces that don't fit together very well. I mean, I do not like the unanimous consensus that dominates college football conversation. The idea that Alabama would have as much changeover as it did around, obviously, Anderson and Young, the two great players, but as much changeover as it's had, and yet 54 of the coaches are like, Alabama, rubber stamp, national championship. Alabama may win it, but I don't think it's easy to predict between the trio of Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia, as has been suggested. I don't believe a team other than those three, Bama, Ohio State, Georgia, will likely win the national championship. But the notion that it's obvious that it will be Bama and maybe Georgia or Ohio State can be lucky to stay close, I don't think it's quite so easy to predict that. All right, we've clearly been on the air too long because now the bots have returned to YouTube. So there you go. All right, last one on DawgNation.com. Hemingway's got Bama going 10-2. I'd be very happy if that became the case. I really would. Hemingway says Florida's also going to be better this year than we hope. It's not going to be a Tennessee story. I mean, look at the early season schedule for Florida. Not only will they be, I believe, favored against Utah, they're probably favored early season against Kentucky, too. That's a home game. It's one, Matt Rugavino talked about all those home games that Florida's playing. One of those is Kentucky. That's a game that Florida also has a chance to win. LSU is a game that Florida has a chance to win. I saw the other day where, and I realize not everybody cares about gambling. I'm just simply giving you like projected outcomes. That's what we're using this conversation for. LSU hosts Tennessee. Tennessee's a 4.5 point favorite in Baton Rouge. So that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of LSU's perceived to be right now. Florida could beat LSU. It seems like a big game, and it might feel sort of big-ish, but Florida could very easily win that game. Y'all, it's not impossible to think that Florida could actually be undefeated going into the Georgia game. I think it probably won't happen because Florida will at least probably lose at Tennessee, but Florida could have a very pretty record going into the Georgia game. Now, they play Texas A&M on the other side of that and South Carolina on the other side of that, so there's some losses that can still come for Florida. But it would not be inconceivable, slightly unlikely, but not inconceivable for Florida to have a kind of a pretty record coming into Jacksonville for that game. That's at least possible. Randy Hall says, how many all-SEC players will Georgia have? If you can give me 6, you can give me another ring. Got to have 6 first-team all-SEC dudes. 6 first-team all-SEC dudes. Half dozen's kind of always my measuring stick, whether it be first-round draft picks, first-team all-SEC. Give me a half dozen, and you're going to be in L.A. come January because that's where the national championship game is. Pete Williams says I don't make bets. It's probably a smart way to live your life. Hugh Nash talking about me quoting Matt Rukavina. Ken Holcomb and all those scouts at Georgia practice. Yeah, there's a reason they're there. There's a reason they are there for sure. That's a good way to close it out for today. Thanks for being here for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all find R.S. Andrews online. If your air conditioning unit, you've been told you need it replaced, it's not keeping you cool the way that it should be, well, get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs. You can find R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com, and they'll get you tuned back up and keep you cool and running all summer long, heading in towards around here, very hot fall as well. And it's just $99. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Also, check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, AJC.com. Braves finish off a 2-game sweep against the Boston Red Sox in dramatic fashion yesterday. Major league debut results in a first career home run. What a great thing that was to be able to see. Plenty more on that when it comes to AJC.com. Also, the AJC Super 11, the top high school players, that's coming out here this week. So that'll be a fun thing to read as you head towards Sunday. Also, the AJC's had a great look back on some of the previous Super 11s in the past. So that's a pretty fun thing there, too. And all kinds of good stuff. So make sure you check it out. Vaughn Grissom, good day for the Braves yesterday, and a lot of fun with the high school football and everything else. AJC.com for that. We will see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. We'll start at 9:45 for our first and 15, 10 a.m. for the rest of the program across all video platforms and everything else after that. We'll see you then, right here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Goodbye for now, everybody.